Well, it looks like it's 2 o'clock, folks, and we'll start to begin. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our first virtual program. My name is Kristen Mooney, and I serve as the Public Affairs Specialist for the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. I'd like to welcome you to our talk this afternoon, entitled Betty Ford and the Equal Rights Amendment. Today's program is one of many happening across the nation, supported by the National Archives and Records Administration in celebration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment. Additional support for our library and museum comes from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Before we begin, I would like to note that we are recording today's discussion for rebroadcast on our YouTube channel. As we move through the program, please make sure that your microphone remains muted. If you're on the phone, you can mute and unmute by using *6. And if during the program you have a question, feel free to use the chat feature and we'll collect those to ask at the end during the question and answer section. At that time, you can also unmute your phone and ask any questions from the telephone. Joining us this afternoon will be Archivist Elizabeth Druga and Curator Don Holloway. Elizabeth specializes in our audiovisual archives. She provides the images, recordings, and video footages that brings our exhibits to life. As curator, Don utilizes the resources from the archives to tell a complete story when orchestrating our feature exhibits and also when we redesign our core exhibits. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth and Don as they discuss Betty Ford and the Equal Rights Amendment.
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon for our talk. As Kristen said, this is part of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, though we're going to be talking about the 1970s. And 50 years after women win the right to vote, they're still fighting for their equality in other ways. So there's a number of things that are happening at this point in time. You've got the Equal Credit Opportunity Act that's preventing discrimination in lending based on sex or marital status. You've got the implementation of the Title IX regulations barring sex discrimination in education. The Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision on abortion is new in the 1970s. And these are all things that are happening in the United States, but also internationally, it's becoming a topic of discussion as well. In 1975, the United Nations declared it to be International Women's Year. And what this does is provides an opportunity for people to talk about how women fit into society and how do we promote equality between men and women throughout the world. And so where we're going to start today talking about Betty Ford is with a speech she gives at the Greater Cleveland International Women's Year Congress in Cleveland in October of 1975, which is one of the major speeches that she gives as First Lady. And we've got this quote here from the speech. "My own support for the Equal Rights Amendment has shown what happens when a definition of proper behavior collides with the rights of an individual to personal opinions. I do not believe that being First Lady should prevent me from expressing my views." And Don, I think that's one thing that really is a hallmark of Betty Ford's tenure as First Lady.
If you mean expressing her views, yes. She certainly was a candid First Lady. Candor is one of the words that often is used to describe her. And you can see this being expressed here as she is in this speech talking about what is the definition of proper behavior? Whose definition is that? And how do we work with that when it collides with the rights of an individual to her personal opinion? And Betty Ford certainly had her personal opinions. She would be a strong advocate in the White House for the Equal Rights Amendment. Her support for that predates her arrival in the White House, but she would be a strong advocate for a number of things, a number of issues in the White House as well. But what we're focusing on today, of course, is the Equal Rights Amendment. In this speech, she will, and in other talks, she would define what she believed to be a liberated woman. And she said, any woman who feels confident in herself and happy in what she is doing, she says it's a general feeling of positiveness and really being able to live with yourself. This to her was a liberated woman. And this definition of a liberated woman is found within her own experiences, which we'll go into.
Yeah, so I think we're going to look back in history now to see some of the influences that Betty had in her life. She was born Betty Bloomer in 1918, so shortly before the 19th Amendment came to pass. She was the youngest of 3 children in the family. She had 2 older brothers. She was the only girl, though she credits her mother Hortense as being one of the most lasting influences on her life.
Yeah, she said of her mother that the greatest desire in my life, in Betty's life, was to be half as perfect as my mother was. She held her mother in the highest of esteem, leaned on her heavily, also particularly after she turned 16 when her father passed away. And her mother, in the midst of a depression, had to raise a family of Betty and her 2 brothers, Bill and Bob. And her mother would go on to get a real estate license to help do that. So she would become a professional woman in her own sense in the midst of the Depression. But more than that, her mother was invested in the community. Her mother taught her that she needed to be civically active. She needed to contribute to the community. One of the places where her mother contributed most was within a women's organization, which she served as the president of, which was responsible for operating one of the hospitals in Grand Rapids. It was called Mary Free Bed, still is today, still running today. At that time, the hospital focused mainly on underprivileged children and handicapped children. Betty would work in that hospital and she would bring to it dance, which her mother introduces her to when she's 8 years old, which leads to another woman who was hugely influential in Betty's life.
Yes, Martha Graham, modern dance pioneer. You see her here sitting with Betty in the White House in 1976. That was one of the areas where she exerted her influence on her husband. She made sure that President Ford gave Martha Graham the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award. But their connection actually started back in the 1930s when Betty goes to Bennington School of Dance. And then after having that experience, she actually goes to New York City briefly and studies with Martha Graham there as part of her auxiliary dance troupe.
Yeah, and one of the things that Martha taught her, both at Bennington and in New York City, was that a dancer is to meet a situation with courage and the necessity for complete honesty. It's that courage and openness, honesty that Betty Ford would bring to her to that big stage in the White House and would contribute so much to the candor that she spoke with on these issues. But Betty describes Martha as a goddess and someone she worshipped. Martha taught a particular type of dance. It's called modern dance, by Martha's own description of it. And it was a dance that was rooted in America, in the concept of America. Many of its themes that she worked out in her choreography, in her performances, interpreted events in American history. The celebrated composer Aaron Copland would score some of her productions. This was particularly appealing to Betty because one of Betty's great loves was reading in American history. And this sense of trying to find something that is uniquely American, invested in this dance and in the fine arts, is also something that Betty would bring with her to the White House. She described Martha as my very, very favorite person, one of the outstanding women of the world. She is my teacher, and she helped shape my life.
But before bringing this to the White House, Betty Ford first takes it back to her hometown and briefly becomes, as she describes herself, the Martha Graham of Grand Rapids. And this is a period in her life where she is both teaching dance, choreographing her own pieces, starting her own dance troupe of sorts, and also continuing from something she had done in her teenage years, working at a local department store called Herpelsheimer's, where she had started as a model in their tea room and then sort of rose through the ranks to become a fashion coordinator who was organizing those fashion shows she had used to model in and going on buying trips to New York City.
Yeah, she comes and goes with Herpelsheimer's. She starts there when, I think in 1932, in the Depression, to help pay for her dance lessons. She would model clothing in the tea room of Herpelsheimer's. And then she is, when she comes back from New York in 1940, in 1942, she marries a fellow by the name of Bill Warren, a marriage that would last for about 5 years. In 1947, September of 1947, they secure a divorce. But in between time, Bill and Betty return to Grand Rapids. When they do, Betty would return to Herpelsheimer's and continue working there. Eventually, she becomes the assistant fashion coordinator, then the fashion coordinator, which leads her back to New York on these buying trips. But here she is establishing her own professional career, and it's a career she believes that she's going to continue with in 1947, but other things intervene.
And the other thing that intervenes is she meets Gerald Ford. And along with that, she's also introduced to his mother, Dorothy, who isn't quite as big of an influence on her as her own mother or Martha Graham. But I think it is worth noting Betty is coming into her relationship with Jerry as a divorced woman. And this was something his mother actually had also been divorced. Gerald Ford's biological father had been abusive towards her, and she left very shortly after her son was born, within 2 weeks, sought a divorce in the 1910s, around 1913 or 14, and started her life over in Grand Rapids to get to the point, up to where Jerry and Betty meet and get married.
And she finds a woman who is very accepting of her, and another strong woman. You look at each of these women who are influential in Betty's life, from Hortense to Martha Graham to Dorothy, and each of them is in her own right a strong woman. And she sees Dorothy raising a family of 4 boys and marvels at her strength to be able to do that. But Dorothy and Hortense knew one another from their common civic civic participation in Grand Rapids. So the families knew one another, not well, but their paths crossed at church and at civic organizations in activities around Grand Rapids. Here's a woman who had a strong sense of self and a strength that gave her own independence within the community. And I think Betty found something she could cling to there.
And so in 1947, Jerry and Betty get engaged, and he tells her they have to wait to get married, but doesn't quite tell her why at first. And the reason why is he's going to be running for Congress. And the fact that she is divorced, he wants to keep that a little hushed up because they do live in a conservative district and he's concerned how that might impact the campaign. But he does handily win that first election and embarks on what ends up being a 25-year congressional career. And so Betty's life goes in sort of a completely different direction at this point from the career that, as Dawn mentioned, she had envisioned for herself.
It does, and I think it's worth pointing out here also that to this point, what we've not found in Betty are any political leanings. She's not made any political statements. She's not promoted any political positions. She is, by her own description, pretty much an apolitical person. So when she meets this attorney with whom she falls in love, and then in February of 1948 becomes engaged to, and then finds herself in a political arena, him contending for a congressional seat, this is new to her, and she loves it. She finds herself captivated by it and pulling other women into it, even as she says she believed he probably wasn't going to win, because congressmen are old people and you don't unseat congressmen. And so she didn't have a great deal of hope, perhaps, for Jerry's success, but she reveled in it when he did win the primary, and then they're married in October of 1948. A few weeks later, he wins the election, and then a few weeks later, they're off to Washington to find an apartment and to start a new life. It's also the time when Hortense passes away in November, I believe it was, 1948, when they're in Washington looking for an apartment. But she finds in this congressman a man who is ambitious, and she is ambitious for him as well. And she's equally determined not to be left behind. So she throws herself into learning about what it means to be a congressman and what it means to be active in Washington, D.C. She's meeting with different clubs of the wives of other congressmen, Supreme Court leaders, and cabinet members. She meets with Bess Truman in the White House, and with other first ladies as time passes. She learns how bills are passed through Congress. She learns the different committees within Congress. She learns about the three branches of government, which she will turn into, along with Betty Vanek, who was the wife of a Democratic congressman from Ohio, I believe, a series of films produced by Westinghouse that would teach students about the three branches of government. You see that image on the right hand of your screen. So she's determined not to be left behind, even as between 1950 and 1957, the family grows to 4 children.
And that's what you see on the other side of the screen, Jerry and Betty with their children, Mike, Jack, Steve, and Susan at their home.
Elizabeth, you might have gotten frozen on Google Meets, but yeah,
to be a profession.
Well, yeah, we lost you there for a little bit, Elizabeth. You froze up, and so I'm not quite sure where you left off. But,
the main point I was getting to was how she came to see homemaking as a profession, that there was as much labor that was going into raising a family and keeping a home as there was into supporting her husband's career.
She'll talk about that in her speeches later on, and in her writings and in interviews that she gives with the press. One of the reasons why she could make this profession successful is because of the person in the middle, Clara Powell. joined the family also. Clara was an African-American woman. She and her husband lived in Washington, D.C., and Betty and Jerry hired her to help with the raising of the kids because Jerry is gone so much, particularly by 1964 when he moves into leadership. He's gone probably more often than he's there. And he would credit Clara's help in the family with him being able to continue as a congressman. Had it not been for Clara, I probably couldn't have continued to be a congressman, he said. Betty loved Clara. The kids loved Clara. Clara wanted to be a nurse, but it was very difficult at that time for an African-American woman to secure the education necessary to become a nurse, something she, as Betty pointed out, she was gifted at. And I think it helped inform Betty's conviction for the movement for equal rights.
And that's something that as their lives move forward, in 1973, they go in a slightly different direction again when Spiro Agnew resigns the vice presidency and Richard Nixon selects Gerald Ford to be his new vice president. And that makes Betty Ford into the second lady. And she sort of, after these 25 years where she was focusing more on being a wife and a mother, suddenly she's starting to step back onto the stage a bit more.
Yeah, they had a plan. She and Jerry had a plan. After the 1972 election, Jerry decided that he would run one more time, see President Nixon through his second term in office, and then in 1976 they would return to Grand Rapids. History intervened with that plan, and Betty finds herself on a new stage, one she hadn't quite anticipated, and one, frankly, that terrified her, particularly when she had to face the press. It's not that she hadn't faced the press before. As a congressman's wife, she had done a number of things with the press, but often it was her fashion, modeling clothes for a layout, talking about fashion, how to arrange your wardrobe, these sorts of things. But now the press is interested in her as a person, and she's talking with them about that. And she says that it terrified them. But then again, she draws upon that strength she learned in her career as a dancer to manage this stage, that courage and that honesty that Martha Graham had talked with her about. And so she finds herself giving interviews to people like Barbara Walters and talking about things like the Roe versus Wade decision, about the psychiatric care that she had sought in the mid-1960s to help her regain her sense of self-worth, and talking honestly about the pinched nerve in her neck, the arthritis that's come on, and the medication that she is taking as a consequence of this. So she's beginning to find her voice as a second lady.
And she's also beginning to talk about women's rights more at this point as well. On the slide here, we have a picture from where she attended the ribbon cutting at the opening of the Women's Center for Lifelong Learning at Utah State in 1974. And this is a speech where she doesn't come out and actually say equal rights amendment or expressly support it, but she's talking about that being an issue for everyone to be concerned about, equal pay for equal work, and also drawing back from her own experiences that just because someone steps away from work to become a wife and mother, that shouldn't be something that penalizes them if they want to go back and resume a career. And so she's starting to talk about these issues more. And then 1974 happens, and Richard Nixon resigns as a result of Watergate. Gerald Ford becomes 38th President of the United States, and Betty Ford becomes the instant First Lady alongside him. And one of the interesting things in sort of inaugural addresses is she gets a mention whenever Gerald Ford gives his remarks after he's sworn in. She's
the first wife ever to be mentioned in a president's inaugural address, swearing in speech. I love your title for this slide, Instant First Lady, because I think it's worth pointing out. He was nominated to the vice presidency in October of 1973. He becomes the vice president when Congress confirms that nomination in December. So she has a period of preparation for her transition from second lady to first lady. It is near instantaneous, and you can only imagine what a shock that that must have been. She says in her memoirs, she writes, "I'll move to the White House, do the best I can, and if they don't like it, they can kick me out, but they can't make me somebody I'm not." Not quite sure who they is in that quote. Is people within the White House, people outside the White House, the American public? Not quite sure who that is, but she goes in at least with this conviction. She is going to be herself, and that's all that she can be. And so you see that image on the left-hand side of the screen where she gives her first press conference. I believe it's the first press conference held by a first lady since Mamie Eisenhower. But in this press conference, she talks about things that are important to her, among them art. She comes from that fine arts background and loves American art. And in this period where we're drawing closer to the bicentennial, she will promote American arts in the White House. But she talks about her devotion also to the causes of mentally handicapped children. She had been working for years as a volunteer at a hospital, the Hospital for Sick Children outside of Washington, D.C. But she also talks about her role as a homemaker, as Elizabeth has pointed out already. So she's beginning to find her voice, and also her confidence, her assertiveness here. In response to one question by a reporter on how often are you going to have these press conferences, she replies, "As often as I think the press has anything of interest to ask."
And she also, at this press conference, is asked about the Equal Rights Amendment and if it's something that she's going to promote. And she says, yes, it's definitely something that I want to work on. But while that sort of made her comfortable in, she's getting more comfortable in front of the press, at the same time, there's another event that helps her realize how much power there is in the position of being First Lady. And that's when she's diagnosed with breast cancer at the end of September of 1974. And she talks about going to the hospital and lying in bed, and they were very open about her operation. The White House press office put out regular hospital bulletins to update the public about how she was progressing. And she talks about seeing the reaction to the announcements about what was happening with her own health and the outpouring of support that she received from the public.
She said the diagnosis knocked the wind out of me, she said. She described it as a terrible jolt to her, more so to her husband and her family than to her. I think she had never seen her husband so distraught over something before.
She talks about that as first leader.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth. But she also saw it as the diagnosis as a blessing because it was, as she said, the first time, the first sign she had of how powerful this position was. She used this power on this newfound stage to advocate strongly for the Equal Rights Amendment. It was an argument that she enjoined, and she said it's one for which she said the Equal Rights Amendment is a must. There are any number of great arguments for it, and she said pointedly, I've never heard a good Phyllis Schlafly argument against the ratification of the amendment.
And the Ford administration is sort of a critical point in the fight for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. This is something that came directly out of the fight for the vote for women in the 19-teens, the 19th Amendment in 1920. The text of this amendment was quite simple. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The Equal Rights Amendment had originally been introduced in Congress in 1923, co-written by Alice Paul, who had founded the National Women's Party in 1913. And she had been one of the main driving forces behind the push for a national amendment for women's suffrage. And so after the 19th Amendment was passed, she wasn't willing to rest on her laurels. She was looking for the next way to find equality for women. And this is what she felt was the next horizon that they needed to push for. And so on one side of the screen,
I think we may be pushing our bandwidth here.
You see different houses of Congress passed it and sent it to the states for ratification.
We lost you again for a little bit, Elizabeth. I mean, we may be testing our bandwidth here on Google Meets. But the the fight had been enjoined. How many states had ratified by the time 1974 had come around?
33.
So we had 33 states that had ratified it. We needed 38 to complete the ratification. It was at this, as she's entering the White House, it's at this time also that the opposition is really finding their voice. That's led by the Stop ERA group, whose pamphlet you can see on the right-hand side of that screen, led by Phyllis Schlafly, who was a woman of her own accomplishments. She had degrees in political science from the Washington University and from Harvard, but and was published one of the most widely read newsletters in the United States. But as Mrs. Ford pointed out before other audiences, we're not here pushing to celebrate the lucky few who rise to the top, but we're here to advocate for the many who need equality. She enjoins the argument as she advocates before the American people in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. Next slide.
And part of the reason this was so important, why there was such a push, was that the deadline for ratification was coming up in 1979. And so there was a deadline looming during the Ford administration. But Betty used her platform to advocate for it. In one of her speeches before the Homemaking and Identity Conference, she said, "I'm in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment, not only for equal pay for equal work, but because I feel every woman should have the right to decide the direction of her life." And again, this back to that or that if they chose one instead of the other, they shouldn't be penalized for that or told that they had made the wrong choice.
Yeah, she would say that if men were to put a dollar amount on everything that a homemaker does, that a wife does, from being a chauffeur to being a nurse, to being a scheduler, to being a project manager, to all of these different things, a husband couldn't afford a wife. So she saw value in her career as a homemaker that needed to be honored by by the American public. And she saw the Equal Rights Amendment as being a step toward that. Her comments caused rift inside the White House as well as outside the White House. There was tension between the West Wing and the East Wing over the remarks that she was making and the efforts that she was putting forth also to secure this ratification. She was advocating it not just with words, but also with deeds.
Yeah, and you see her on the phone here in her office in the East Wing of the White House. And one of the things that she would do was call legislators in the states that were going to be voting on ratification. She called people in states, Illinois, Arizona, North Carolina, and she was really looking to have conversations with them to express her support and also encourage them to give it a hearing and allow their legislatures to vote on the proposal.
Yeah, she was careful here because you have things like the Hatch Act and others where you have to walk something of a fine line between the political steps that you can take and or that you can't take and still be an advocate for your cause. There was a presentation in the White House, in the White House Theater, where there was pushback from the press when she brought in people to brief the White House staff on the standing of the ERA in the states. And she described it's not, we weren't telling them what to think. We were just giving them information about where we're at with the fight for ERA. She was equally careful calling the legislators, saying, I'm not telling you how to vote. I'm not urging you to vote this way. I'm just simply urging you to bring it to the floor of your state house for a vote and to allow members in the legislature to vote their conscience. But this earned her some tension in the West Wing and also some protests outside the White House. And perhaps some tension with her own Secret Service staff.
And that brings us to the next slide, and one of the favorite artifacts in our collection, which is Betty Ford's bloomer flag. She would talk about ERA with pretty much anyone she could, and that included some of her skeptical Secret Service agents, such as Dick Hartwig, who you see standing next to her in the picture on the left. And they had sort of this very friendly rivalry over it, which resulted in him asking a friend of his who knew how to sew to make this flag for her. And one of her pushes for equality had to do with the fact that the president and foreign dignitaries all would come to the White House and had flags flying on their car. And she wanted to know, if the president gets flags, why doesn't the first lady? And so this was what his friend, her name was Sarah Brinkerhoff, made for Mrs. Ford.
And she said when she received it, she loved it and said, this should be under glass in a museum. And well, guess where it's at now? Under glass in the lobby of the library in Ann Arbor. She got to see it placed in a museum.
But you see the bloomers, which are a play on her maiden name, and then ERA #1. So just like Betty Ford, it's not subtle about her support for the Equal Rights Amendment. Another male audience that she frequently talked to about the ERA was her own husband. He would make comments that Betty always kept him up to date on what was happening with it. And that was not the only area related to women's rights where she lobbied her husband.
She called this lobbying in her memoirs pillow talk. And I think this Pat Oliphant cartoon captures it quite well. I don't know whether you can see the caption underneath this one, but there is the president laboring over people he's considering for a Supreme Court nomination. William O. Douglas has resigned from the court, and now he has the opportunity to replace him. And there's Betty in the background, and she's telling the president in Pat Oliphant's words, a conservative choice will give you trouble in the Senate. A liberal choice will give you trouble from Reagan. And if you don't choose a woman, I'll make your life hell. He had chosen women in his administration. He had Carla Hills as his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Anne Armstrong was moved to Ambassador of the Court of St. James in Great Britain. Shirley Temple Black was ambassador to Ghana and then made Chief of Protocol of the United States. And other women were appointed to roles in positions they were skilled at. And that's what Mrs. Ford wanted, was women who were qualified to have opportunity to fill these positions and to make it less of a man's world and more of an equal rights world.
And Betty did later say that she felt her greatest disappointment was that he didn't appoint a woman to the Supreme Court. But despite that failure on her part, she was recognized for her other achievements. The National Women's Party awarded her their very first Alice Paul Award in 1975, though it wasn't officially presented to her until 1977. But they gave it to her for her distinguished service in the cause of the Equal Rights Amendment. So this was an award from an organization who had been pushing for decades for the Equal Rights Amendment. And they recognized that as First Lady, some people had questioned how effective her lobbying had been, since many of the state legislatures didn't ratify the Equal Rights Amendment after she had made her phone calls. I believe there's only one or two states, I think only one state ratified during the Ford administration. But they felt that despite that, she had made a very positive impact on the campaign.
And if we go to the next slide. Or has Elizabeth, did Elizabeth
The
freeze?
date that they gave the award to her was significant, birthday.
And I think we're on the countdown. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, you froze up again.
Oh, sorry.
It's the wonderful world we live in right now, the challenging world that we live in. We don't have equal rights of bandwidth yet. But in any case, she would continue the push for ERA. Congress would extend the opportunity for states to ratify the amendment under the original ratification deadline. I think Indiana was the last state to ratify it in 1977. And then under the extension, I don't believe any states ratified it. There were some that rescinded their ratification. It's a fight that continues, though not without an official congressional deadline, I suppose it is. I'm not quite sure just where it stands right now. But Mrs. Ford would continue to advocate for it as she moved from the White House into her post-First Ladyship, but she also would continue to speak with candor on a number of different issues. She was among the first prominent people to openly advocate for increased funding for the fight against HIV/AIDS and for equal rights for same-sex couples. She would fight with Rosalind Carter before congressional committees for funding for women's health and for mental health issues. And of course, most famously, she founded her own treatment center in California, the Betty Ford Clinic, to help those with alcohol and chemical dependency as well. Hers was a fight that continued for the remainder of her life. She never really left the stage that she found first with Second Lady and then with First Lady.
And as she said in the speech, the fight for human rights won't be complete without freedom for women.
And with that, Kristen, I think if we have any questions from the audience, we'd be happy to take them.
So we did have we had a sidebar conversation regarding the Hatch Act on the chat over here. And Joel asked, how long has the Hatch Act been around? And thanks to Susan and Google, we discovered that it was in 1939 that was enacted.
Very early.
And so that was one of the sidebars. But if anyone on the phone or you'd like to unmute your microphones at this point, we'd be happy to take any questions. Well, with that, I think Don and Elizabeth, you did a fantastic job this afternoon educating us on Betty Ford and the equal amendments. I would just like to take a few moments to talk about two more virtual events that we have coming up. You may have noticed that we are going to be celebrating the Greatest Generation Day in early September. And on September 1st at 6:30 p.m., we invite you to join us live on Facebook. Won't be through Google Meets for this one, but it will be broadcast live on Facebook. And that will be an event honoring the ultimate sacrifice given by some of the Allied nations during World War II. Jimmy Felice will be speaking at that event. And again, that will be on Facebook Live. And then again on September 2nd on Facebook Live at 7 p.m., you can hear journalist Chris Wallace talk about his book, Countdown to 1945. And if you're in the Grand Rapids area on September 2nd and along the Grand River, if you look up, you might notice 3 military airplanes doing a low flyover. And that is also in celebration of the Greatest Generation Day. And that's a citywide celebration just honoring our World War II veterans and the civilians during that time. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.